John Dodd is the president of the Jesse Helms Center Foundation. He worked for Jesse Helms for many years. When Senator Helms was our one of our two North Carolina senators, and he's written a book, and the world came his way. Jesse Helms' Contributions to Freedom, which is available. We'll tell you how you can get the book, but let me welcome in John Dodd. Good morning, John. How are you?
I'm doing great.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
You and I have mutual friends, and we were
sure
just
do.
sitting here talking about it, but I've never met you. You know, I was just thinking about it. I never met Senator Helms. I don't think I ever met Senator Helms.
Oh, that's a shame.
I know it.
He would have greatly enjoyed meeting you.
Well,
he would have been on your program. I know that multiple times. If
you know,
I
don't. I'm thinking back, and I don't actually remember ever meeting him, even through our broadcast association work. I mean, I heard him speak a few times, but he was one of my heroes. And
you would be one of his heroes.
I appreciate you saying that. I want to talk about what you're doing now with the Jesse Helms Center Foundation, but let's talk about your days with Jesse Helms. You were one of his closest associates, worked on his staff for many years. Talk about those days. What comes to mind when you think about Jesse Helms now?
Well, the thing that's most interesting is that he was about the nicest guy I ever knew. You know, he really treated people with great respect, and doesn't matter your station in life. He was a true gentleman to everyone. He was the most popular senator on Capitol Hill, as voted by the Washingtonian magazine, by the staff. So you know your staff people, your elevator operators, your people in the garage. I mean, that was the unique thing people didn't know about Jesse Helms so often, unless you'd had an interaction with him. Of course, you know he was a tough-nosed politician, but that was. Jesse Helms, a man, was the most impressive thing to me personally.
When you hear the name Jesse Helms today, people immediately react in a certain way. Liberals don't react too positively to him. You know, Senator Helms said what he thought. He said some things that today would probably be pretty controversial, but for his time, he was representing the way that people felt about conservatism back in those days. When you say his name now to a lot of folks who are conservatives, they were like, yeah, he was the guy that really kind of started it all. Fred Barnes, the conservative commentator, called him the father of modern day conservatism. Is all that fair?
I think so, in many ways. I mean, there were many fathers. I mean, it's hard to pick one person, but you know, in the 70s when he first came to the United States Senate, as he used to say, the conservatives and the Senate could meet in a phone booth. I mean, there were that few, and so therefore, they had to lay the groundwork for a lot of things. So, his job, he felt, was to kind of take issues, build a little interest in them, maybe get out in front, carry the flag. Then he had some other people. Then he'd pass the flag and he'd move on to another issue, and So I think it is true, and also. Probably his most important contribution is, for the long term, was in the 1976 presidential campaign when he endorsed Ronald Reagan over an incumbent president, Gerald Ford, and really made it possible for North Carolina through a win in the North Carolina primary, which was the first win of Reagan's presidential campaigns. Mm-hmm. He made it possible for Reagan to move on to the convention, and be a serious candidate, and then the front runner for 1980. And so I think it is fair to say he is the father, if not at least one of the principal fathers.
Well, that moment alone, when he endorsed Ronald Reagan for president, probably had as much to do with the modern conservative movement as anything we can think of, right? Because Ronald Reagan, as Michael pointed out earlier when I said who would you say was the father of modern day conservatism, he said Ronald Reagan, but Jesse Helms made it possible in many ways for Ronald Reagan to be who he ended up being.
Well, the interesting thing about that is there was a history with Ronald Reagan, because Jesse Helms was a broadcaster like you at WRAL, and he, as Ronald Reagan was a broadcaster with GE, the electric, they had their theater that on TV at that time, and So they got to know each other first through that. And then actually, while he was governor, Senator Helms went to California. This is before Nixon had resigned, and talked to him about running for president, and said he would endorse him. So once the Ford became president, he had an out with Ford. He said, "Well, I've already told Reagan I endorsed him." So he was actually the first senator, and then after him, of course, was Paul Laxalt to endorse Ronald Reagan.
John Dodd, the president of the Jesse Helms Center Foundation, live in the studio with us this morning. You think about the most important and maybe popular politicians in North Carolina history, you think about really two names, Jesse Helms, and then you have to say the other would be Jim Hunt.
Yes.
And they ran, and Jim Hunt challenged Jesse Helms. Was it 84?
Yes, sir.
I was trying to think it was 80 or 84. So they challenged each other. Jim Hunt challenged Jesse, and the Democrats were like, we're going to put an end to this Jesse Helms thing once and for all. We're going to put our big dog up. So they put Jim Hunt up to run against Jesse Helms in 1984. And, man, I remember it was a slugfest. I mean, it was epic.
Yes, it was. I mean, I was involved very much in that campaign. And that was we were down 20 points a year out. And we just slogged back and kind of took Jim Hunt down a notch or two, and through extensive media advertising, which was more concentrated at that time. You didn't have the
about
internet.
$20 million spent on that race?
$25 million, I believe.
Think about $25 million in 1984 dollars. What would that equate to today? Unbelievable.
You know, it was quite a lot of work. I was raising the money. I didn't write the ads or nothing. I was involved in raising the money. Just part of a pretty extensive team, and we went out to put the dragnet out across the country, and Jesse had a lot of friends. He had a lot of people out across the country who said, well, I don't like my senator. You're my senator, and so they supported him. But it was quite a race, and luckily we prevailed.
What was the turning point? You said you were down 20 points and came back to win it. How'd you do that? What was the strategy? Do you remember the discussions about how you were going to get back in it and win it and that kind of thing, and how it actually happened?
Well, I think the turning point was when Jim Hunt went to Washington as part of the Governors Association, and he. We were the first campaigns to go send a cameraman around to actually video our opponent and everything he did,
which they now refer to as a trailer. Is that what they call
something
it?
Like that? Yeah,
a tracer.
A
tracer.
Yeah. And they're all the time everywhere.
Yeah.
You heard it with George Allen a few years ago. He got the Maca thing. He got in trouble with that. So everybody does that, but that wasn't a regular feature in back in the 80s, and I think we weren't the first to do that, and so we had a camera on him when he sat around with the other the Governors Association, and they endorsed Mondale's tax plan, and he raised his hand and said he was in favor of more taxes. So when he came back here and said, well, he wasn't, he didn't support more taxes, well, we just put the ad on television saying, Jim Hunt. He says he doesn't support taxes, but in Washington,
did you use
the
term flip flop?
Yeah.
Was that the first flip flop?
It was just where do you stand, Jim? Was really the thing, and that was a series.
Right. Where do you stand, Jim?
So we had gone. There was a series of ads that had portrayed him that way. So he was. So we showed that he was likely to go to Washington and be the typical politician, say one thing at home and do something else in Washington. And I think that really proved the point and undercut his credibility.
John Dodd of the Jesse Helms Center Foundation. What do you think Jesse Helms' legacy is?
Well, surprisingly, he is still very relevant. We do a Google alerts, because part of our mission, of course, is historical. We have the senator's papers. We're partnered with Wingate University, so we have that historical mission. And we do Google Alerts weekly, and he's mentioned at least 4 or 5 times. I mean, Madeleine Albright gave a speech just last week and told the Jesse story. Biden told us Jesse's story, the commencement speech. I think it was at Harvard. They're positive stories. Now, of course, not all the stories are positive, but we tracked it against comparing it to Kennedy or Dole or something, and there's no comparison. He just had his hand in many issues. So I think, that he was important in that sense. He was a principled leader. I think he pointed the way for many of our leaders today. Ted Cruz says that he gave his first political contribution to Jesse Helms when off his newspaper route, and he was like 15 years old, and he made a direct mail contribution. So, but I think it really maybe his most important long-term contribution is the legacy to the young people that he trained throughout his time there, and the legacy that he touched, and of the young people that he touched. And
you talk about him being relevant today. What he thinks and what he would think about politics today is still relevant. We saw it play out in the congressional race here with Walter Jones 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. Taylor Griffin was campaigning on the fact to conservatives in the primary 2 years ago, and we don't know if this will be the strategy this year, but Taylor was a lot of his campaign information, he touted the fact that he worked for Jesse Helms. And then lo and behold, Mrs. Helms did a radio ad endorsing Walter Jones. It's like, I'm conservative. No, I'm conservative. I'm more conservative. Look, Jesse endorsed me. No, Mrs. Helms endorsed me.
Well,
so it matters still, doesn't it?
It does matter. But, for instance, like many of the people that are in Washington, you have David Rouser was a former aide. George Holding was a former aide. And we got, that Robert Pittenger is a former member of the Helms Center board. There are just many people in Washington that are still having influence on policy. That's important, and that's what the Jesse Helms Center is about. Because his mission to me was, when I took the job, he said, do programs for young people that are going to promote the principles that you and I fought for so many years.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you next. Tell us about the Jesse Helms Center. Where is it located, and what do you do? We
are located at really across the street from Wingate University, outside Charlotte, in Senator Helms' hometown close to his hometown of Monroe, and they gave him a scholarship in the 1930s, and during the Depression, to come to school. And so he wanted to pay him back. He gave him his papers. They set up the foundation, and so we're a separate nonprofit, but we work closely with the university in various educational projects. And our mission is to promote the traditional values and the things that Senator Helms fought for throughout his career. One of our big focuses is free enterprise, and we have in fact, we got 100 young people over at Campbell this week doing our Free Enterprise Leadership Challenge, where they learn entrepreneurship, ethical leadership, and our founding principles. And that's been a real focus. In fact, this is our 20th anniversary. Over 8,000 graduates for that program.
What's the website if people want to? People might want to donate to the foundation.
Our website is
find out more.
It's www.jessehelmscenter.org, and we also have just started a new online program for this. So we do it at several colleges throughout the summer, and so it's great for and we target high school students because we feel like that's really there's a real need there. So, but if you want to learn more about that program, you can learn it at jessehelmscenter.org. Or you want to see our online program is freeenterprisenow.com, freeenterprisenow.com.
And can your book, again, the name of the book is And the World Came His Way. Is this book available?
Yes.
On the website?
On the website. Also, Senator Helms' autobiography is also on there and on the website. And some people that might like it.
I just noticed on the back of your book, it's the Fred Barnes quote.
Yes.
I'm going to read it. Hit Fred Barnes, who, of course, is the conservative commentator at Fox News, Weekly
Standard, yes.
Couldn't remember if it was that or National Journal. Here's what Fred Barnes said. Next to Ronald Reagan, Jesse Helms is the most important conservative of the last 25 years. No conservative, save Reagan, comes close to matching Helms' influence on American politics and policy in the quarter century since he won a Senate seat in North Carolina. And you can read more about that in John's book, And the World Came His Way, by John Dodd. And you can get it at Jesse Helms Center.org.
Yes.
Right. Thank you for being here.
Okay, it's my pleasure.
Fascinating. Great stories. I love it. We did have you back and talk more about Jesse. That's
Well, I'd love to. Anytime.
Yeah, good to see you. Nice to meet you.
Nice meeting
All
you,
right,
sir.
John Dodd, the president of the Jesse Helms Center Foundation.